"He's down here," the little girl said, pointing at the concrete lid. "But when they remove it, they find something shocking. Let me know what you thought of this story by giving it a rating from 0 to 10 and tell me which city you're watching from. I'd love to know if you enjoyed my story and get to know you better, so please subscribe to my channel to support my work. I'm counting on your help." The town square of Maple Creek was buzzing with the typical energy of a Midwestern morning when Arthur Harrison, 58, crossed the cobblestone walkways with his meticulous and calculated steps. Each step reflected his obsessive personality, a need for control and perfection that had made him the most respected businessman in the region. His company, Harrison Construction, had erected half of the commercial buildings in town, and his reputation as an inflexible man in business was known to all. Dressed in his impeccable grey suit and carrying an Italian leather briefcase, Arthur constantly checked his Swiss wristwatch. He had an important meeting in 15 minutes with investors from Chicago, and lateness was not in his vocabulary. His routine was sacred. Every morning he walked from his mansion in the upscale neighborhood to his office downtown, observing with a critical eye every detail of the city he had helped build. It was during this routine walk that something unexpected happened. A small, dirty hand insistently tugged at the sleeve of his expensive suit, leaving smudges of dirt on the immaculate fabric. Arthur looked down with growing irritation and saw a girl of about 4 with tangled, knotted hair, torn clothes that looked like they hadn't been washed in weeks, and bare feet caked in dried mud. She desperately shouted for the gentleman, her large, dark eyes shining with urgency, insisting that there was someone down there. She pointed insistently at a heavy concrete sewer cover located near the central gazebo in the square. Arthur tried to pull away from the girl, roughly adjusting the sleeve of his jacket. He told her to get away, that he was late. His voice carried that cold authority he usually reserved for incompetent employees. But Lily was not intimidated. On the contrary, her small, desperate voice grew louder. She begged him, "Please." The person was hungry and hurt, she continued, tears beginning to stream down her dirty cheeks. She cried that nobody believed her, that everyone just ignored her. The raw sincerity in the child's plea did something strange in Arthur's chest. For a moment, his stern expression faltered. The square was relatively empty on that Tuesday morning. A few shopkeepers were opening their stores. 1 or 2 people hurried to work, but no one paid attention to the beggar girl who always wandered there. Lily was part of the urban landscape that everyone had learned to ignore. Arthur looked around, checking if anyone was watching. His curiosity, a trait he had inherited from his father and usually suppressed in the name of efficiency, began to stir. There was something in the child's insistence that intrigued him. Perhaps it was how she showed no fear of him, unlike how others reacted to his imposing presence. He asked her what this nonsense was about, but his tone had lost some of its initial harshness. He told her there couldn't be anyone down there, that it was part of the city's sewer system. Lily insisted there was, pulling him by the hand with a surprising strength for someone so small. She had seen him, she had talked to him, he had given her a piece of bread yesterday. Her words tumbled out, mixing tenses as children do when they are very nervous. Against all his instincts as a practical and controlling person, Arthur found himself walking towards the concrete cover. His rational mind screamed that he was wasting precious time on a child's fantasy, but a deeper part of his personality, a morbid curiosity he rarely allowed to surface, compelled him forward. The cover was heavy, very heavy. Arthur had to use all his strength to move it just a few inches. The screech of concrete against metal echoed across the silent square. A strong, unpleasant smell immediately escaped from the opening, a mixture of dampness, dirt, and something else he preferred not to identify. He called out into the darkness, asking if anyone was there, feeling ridiculous for following the advice of a street child. His voice echoed through the underground tunnels like a returning ghost. The answer came faintly, almost a whisper, begging for help. Arthur froze. There really was someone down there. Lily had been right all along. With renewed effort, he managed to move the cover completely, revealing a makeshift ladder of stones and rubble descending into the darkness of the maintenance tunnels. He yelled down to wait, that he would get help. But before he could step away, a figure slowly emerged from the darkness. The man who climbed out of that hole was unrecognizable as a civilized human being. Extremely thin, covered in dirt and rags that were once clothes, his hair and beard grown wild, his skin sunburned and marked with poorly healed sores. His eyes, however, were the most disturbing. There was intelligence there, a lucidity that contrasted brutally with his beggar-like appearance. The man said his name was Ezekiel Stone, his voice hoarse, as if he hadn't spoken in a long time. Arthur watched him with a mixture of horror and fascination. How was it possible for someone to live in those conditions? How long had that man been down there? And why had no one noticed his presence before? Arthur asked how long he had been down there, struggling to process what he was seeing. 5 years, Ezekiel replied simply, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. He explained that Lily had found him 2 years ago. She was his only companion, his eyes filled with tears. As he looked at the little girl, who ran to hug his dirty legs, Arthur felt the world spin around him. 5 years. This man had lived like a rat in the sewers of his own city for 5 years, and no one knew, no one cared, except for a 4-year-old child that everyone ignored. The irony was too bitter to swallow. Arthur asked why he hadn't asked for help, knowing it was a stupid question the moment it left his mouth. Ezekiel laughed, a humorless sound that echoed through the empty streets. "Ask for help from whom?" he questioned. From people like Arthur, who crossed the square every day looking only at their expensive watches. There was no anger in his voice, just a deep resignation that cut Arthur more than any accusation could have. At that moment, standing in the town square of Maple Creek, watching a man who had literally emerged from the city's sewers and a child who was the only one to care, Arthur Harrison felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time, the complete loss of control over a situation. And for the first time in years, it didn't completely terrify him. The news of the discovery in the town square spread through Maple Creek like wildfire. Within 2 hours, half the town knew that Arthur Harrison had found a man living in the sewers for 5 years. The other detail everyone was talking about was that a 4-year-old beggar girl had been responsible for the discovery, a fact that deeply shamed the residents who passed by Lily every day without a second glance. Arthur took Ezekiel and Lily directly to the municipal hospital, where the doctor on duty, Dr. Henry Morris, was shocked by their health status. Ezekiel was severely malnourished, with multiple skin infections and clear signs that he had gone years without proper medical care. Lily, in turn, showed severe nutritional deficiencies for her age, along with signs of having lived on the streets for a long time. Dr. Morris asked Arthur how it was possible that this man had survived in such conditions, as they watched a nurse examine Ezekiel. And this child, he added, clearly had not had adequate parental care for months. Arthur didn't know how to answer. He was trying to process how he had spent 5 years walking over a man who lived in inhuman conditions right beneath his feet. His obsession with control and order had blinded him to the chaos that existed literally under the surface of his perfectly organized city. While Ezekiel received medical care, Arthur called his wife Catherine to explain why he had missed the important meeting. The conversation did not go well. Catherine screamed from the other side of the line, her 54-year-old voice filled with disbelief and anger, asking what he had done. She questioned if he had lost a $2 million meeting for a beggar and a street child, asking if he had gone completely insane. Catherine Harrison was a woman who had built her life around the social respectability and status her husband's money provided. The daughter of a traditional Maple Creek family that had lost its fortune in the 90s crisis, she had married Arthur more for convenience than love, and now she saw her orderly world being threatened by her husband's sudden compassion. Arthur tried to explain that she didn't understand, but his voice sounded weak even to himself. There was a man living like an animal for 5 years, and a 4-year-old child was the only person decent enough to care. Catherine retorted, asking what that had to do with them. They weren't a charity, she stated. They had responsibilities to their family, to their children. Thomas was 17 and preparing for his college entrance exams. Rebecca was 15 and needed stability. She insisted he couldn't just go around saving people. The mention of his children hit Arthur in the chest. Thomas and Rebecca were teenagers he barely knew, so absorbed was he in building his business empire. How many times had he promised to spend more time with them after he closed one more deal, after he expanded to one more city? Now, at 58, he realized he had become a stranger in his own home. Back at the hospital, Arthur found Lily sitting by Ezekiel's bed, holding his thin hand while he rested. The scene was both touching and disturbing. A 4-year-old child showing more compassion and loyalty than most adults Arthur knew. The girl asked him if Grandpa Ezekiel was going to be okay when she saw him approach. Grandpa Ezekiel. The girl had created a family where she had none. Arthur felt a lump in his throat. He assured the little one that he would be fine, that the doctors would take care of him. Lily then asked, with the brutal honesty of children, where she would stay. She wanted to know if she could stay with Grandpa Ezekiel when he got out of the hospital. It was a question Arthur didn't know how to answer. Ezekiel was clearly in no condition to care for a child. He himself needed intensive care and rehabilitation. And Lily? Lily was a girl growing up on the streets without any family structure. Dr. Morris approached them with a grave expression, telling Mr. Harrison that he needed to speak with him. The tests had revealed some concerning information. They moved to a corner of the hallway, away from Lily's hearing. The doctor explained that the man he brought in, Ezekiel, was not just an ordinary homeless person. From the neurological tests they had run, it was evident that he had a higher education, his vocabulary, his reasoning skills. There was more to this story. Arthur frowned, asking what he was trying to say. The doctor said that this man was not born on the streets. He had a life before ending up in that situation, and from the way he spoke, the way he treated the child, he would bet he was a teacher or something similar. The revelation hit Arthur like a punch. Ezekiel wasn't just any beggar. He was someone who had had a life, a profession, possibly a family. What could have happened to drive him to such an extreme situation? Arthur asked about the child, fearing the answer. The doctor replied that Lily was in a state of severe malnutrition, but was a smart and resilient girl. However, she clearly had no responsible caregivers. They would have to contact Child Protective Services to determine her fate. The idea of Lily being taken to an orphanage or a foster family did something strange to Arthur's chest. That girl had shown more humanity in her 4 years of life than he had in his 58. She had saved a man that everyone else ignored. She deserved better than to be just another number in the social assistance system, Arthur said slowly, the words coming out before he could fully think them through. What if he took responsibility for them? Temporarily, of course, until Ezekiel recovered and they could better understand the situation. Dr. Morris looked at him surprised. He warned that this was a very serious decision, that caring for a man in recovery and a traumatized child was not simple, and there were legal issues involved. Arthur knew he was being impulsive, something completely out of his usual character. But for the first time in years, he felt he was doing something genuinely important, something that went beyond profits and contracts. He stated that he had resources, that he could hire the best medical care, psychologists, social workers. He could give them a chance to recover properly. The doctor asked about his family, if his wife would agree. That was the question Arthur feared. Catherine would be furious. His children probably wouldn't understand. He would be bringing two strangers into his orderly and predictable life. He would be taking on responsibilities that could enormously complicate his existence. But as he watched Lily humming softly to a sleeping Ezekiel, Arthur realized that some decisions couldn't be made with the head. Some decisions came from the heart, even when you had spent decades trying to ignore you had one. He finally told the doctor to prepare all the necessary documents. He would take temporary responsibility for both of them, and he would need the doctor to maintain discretion about the case until he could talk properly with his family. As he walked down the hospital corridor, Arthur knew he was about to face the biggest storm of his married life. Catherine would not easily accept his decision, but for the first time in years, he felt he was doing something that truly mattered, something that would define the kind of man he really was, beneath all the expensive suits and corporate titles. The Harrison mansion had never witnessed an argument as intense as the one that erupted that Tuesday night. Arthur arrived home at 8 o'clock, 3 hours later than usual, to find Catherine waiting for him in the living room with an expression he knew well. It was the same one she used when she was about to declare war. She ordered Thomas and Rebecca to their rooms now, without taking her eyes off her husband. The teenagers quickly obeyed, recognizing the signs of an impending family storm. Arthur began, saying he could explain, but was cut off by an imperious gesture from his wife. She asked what there was to explain, that he had unilaterally decided to turn their house into a homeless shelter, that he had compromised their family's future for two complete strangers. Catherine paced the luxurious room, her jewelry tinkling with each sharp movement. Arthur retorted, trying to keep his voice calm, that they weren't complete strangers. Ezekiel was an educated man, probably a teacher before whatever happened to him, and Lily was just a child who needed help. Catherine exploded, shouting that it was a child who was not their responsibility. She reminded Arthur they had their own children to raise, social commitments, and a reputation to maintain. What would people think when they found out they were housing beggars? The concern for public opinion was what irritated Arthur most about Catherine, although he himself had lived for decades guided by the same concerns. He asked since when they cared more about what people thought than about doing what was right. Since always, Catherine screamed back, since he decided to build this business empire based on respectability and social connections. He couldn't just throw it all away for a sudden pang of conscience. At that moment, Thomas came down the stairs silently. At 17, he had inherited his father's curiosity and his mother's stubbornness, a combination that made him incapable of ignoring important family conflicts. He asked his father if it was true that he had found a man living in the town square's sewer. Arthur looked at his son, noticing for the first time in months how much he had grown. Thomas was no longer the boy who played in the yard. He was almost an adult with his own opinions and the capacity for moral judgment. Arthur answered honestly that yes, it was true, and it was a 4-year-old girl who had led him to him, a girl who lived on the streets, because no one cared enough to look after her. Thomas asked if he was going to bring them here, ignoring the murderous look Catherine shot him. Arthur admitted he would like to help them temporarily. Rebecca came downstairs then, too curious to stay in her room. At 15, she possessed an emotional sensitivity that contrasted with the family's pragmatism. She asked with genuine horror if a 4-year-old girl lived on the street. Catherine ordered Rebecca back to her room, but the teenager didn't obey. She asked how it was possible she lived on the street and where her parents were. Arthur felt a lump in his throat. He explained that she was an orphan, and the only person who cared for her was Ezekiel, the man he had found. Thomas asked if they were family. Arthur explained that they weren't exactly blood relatives, but they looked after each other. Lily was the only person in the entire city who cared about Ezekiel's suffering. Catherine realized she was losing control of the situation. Her children were clearly touched by the story, and that was not part of her plan. She told the children this was not their business, that it was a decision for adults. But Rebecca spoke up with a courage that surprised everyone in the room, saying that they lived here too, and if they came to live with them, it would affect their whole family. Catherine thought she had found an ally, agreeing exactly, and that's why they needed to be sensible. Thomas simply said he thought they should help. The ensuing silence was thick with tension. Catherine looked at her eldest son as if he had been infected by his father's madness. She told Thomas he didn't understand the implications. He replied that he did understand. Mother, he understood that a girl his age when he was 4 was living on the street, and a man had spent 5 years eating garbage because nobody cared. And he understood that his father was one of the few people with the power to change that. Rebecca nodded vigorously, asking if they had so much money, why couldn't they use a little to help people who really needed it? Catherine felt the floor crumble beneath her feet. Not only had her husband gone mad, but her own children were siding against him. She said desperately that they didn't understand how the world worked, that they couldn't save everyone. Arthur replied that they weren't trying to save everyone. They were trying to save 2 people who had crossed their path, 2 people who deserved a chance. Catherine tried one last gambit, asking what if they were dangerous? What if this Ezekiel was a criminal? What if this child brought diseases into their home? Rebecca exclaimed, shocked, how her mother could talk about a child like that. Thomas shook his head in disapproval, saying that was exactly the kind of thinking that made people ignore those in need of help. Catherine realized she was alone in the battle. Her own children had turned against her, influenced by what she saw as her husband's dangerous romanticism. She told them they would regret it, heading up the stairs with wounded dignity. She said they would regret it when their lives were turned upside down. After Catherine disappeared upstairs, Arthur was left alone with his children. For a few minutes, no one said anything. Thomas finally spoke, asking his father if he was sure he was doing the right thing. It was an honest question, without judgment. Arthur appreciated his son's maturity. He replied that he wasn't sure of anything, Thomas, but he knew that if he did nothing, he would carry this guilt for the rest of his life. Rebecca, speaking for both siblings, said that then they supported him. The next morning, Arthur returned to the hospital to find Ezekiel slightly better. The bath, the food, and a night's sleep in a clean bed had done wonders for his appearance, though he was still visibly frail. Ezekiel told Mr. Harrison that he needed to tell him something important, something about himself that might change his opinion about helping him. Arthur felt a chill in his stomach. Maybe Catherine was right about hidden dangers. He asked what Ezekiel wanted to tell him. Ezekiel took a deep breath, clearly struggling with a painful memory. He said his real name wasn't Ezekiel Stone. It was Ezekiel Harrison. The world stopped. Arthur felt as if the floor had disappeared from under his feet. Harrison. Ezekiel confirmed it. He was Arthur's father. The father he believed had abandoned him when he was 12 years old. The revelation fell on Arthur like a hammer. His father, the man he had hated for decades for abandoning the family, was there before him, transformed into an unrecognizable beggar. The irony was too brutal to process. The silence in the hospital room stretched for minutes that felt like hours. Arthur stared at the skeletal man before him, trying to find some trace of the father he remembered. Ezekiel Harrison had been an imposing man, a respected literature teacher at the state high school, with an upright posture and a warm smile. The man before him was a ghostly shadow of those memories. Arthur finally said that he had lied to him, his voice laden with 4 decades of pain. He had abandoned them. He had left his mother alone with 2 children and a debt that almost destroyed them. Ezekiel closed his eyes, tears streaming down his suffering-marked face. He said he hadn't abandoned them, son. He was thrown out. His mother, Eleanor, forced him out of the house after she discovered the debts he had incurred trying to save St. Vincent's orphanage. Arthur asked what orphanage, confused, saying he never worked in any orphanage. Ezekiel explained with a weak voice that he didn't work there officially, but he gave voluntary literature classes to the children every afternoon after his regular job. When he learned the orphanage would be closed for lack of funds, he took out loans, used their money, even secretly sold some things from the house. He couldn't let 52 children be thrown onto the streets. Arthur felt as if he were hearing a stranger's story. For all these years, he had constructed a narrative in which his father was an irresponsible man who had fled his family obligations. Discovering there was a completely different explanation shook the foundations of his identity. He murmured that his mother found out. Ezekiel confirmed it, saying the creditors came knocking on their door. Eleanor was furious, called him irresponsible, said he loved strangers more than his own family. She was pregnant with his brother Gabriel at the time and was emotionally fragile. She screamed that he had destroyed their future for children who weren't even theirs. Arthur vaguely remembered his mother's pregnancy, the tension that had filled the house in the months before his father disappeared. He also remembered the little brother who was born premature and had not survived, a trauma the family never properly overcame. Ezekiel continued, his voice growing weaker, that she gave him an ultimatum. Either he found the money to pay off all the debts immediately, or she never wanted to see him again. He tried, Arthur. He went to banks, loan sharks, anyone who could lend him the money. But no one would lend to a teacher with a sullied name in town. Arthur accused him of just disappearing, though his anger was subsiding, replaced by a painful confusion. Ezekiel explained that his mother changed the locks. When he tried to come home 3 days later, she shouted from the window that if he showed up again, she would call the police. She said that he and she were better off without him. Ezekiel paused, fighting a coughing fit. He had wandered around Maple Creek for weeks, trying to find work, trying to find a way back to them. But he couldn't get a job because everyone knew about the debts, and his mother had spread the word around town that he had abandoned the family. Arthur processed each word like a punch to the gut. His mother, Eleanor, had been a bitter woman for the rest of her life, raising him with constant resentment against the father who abandoned them. She had died when Arthur was 25, taking her version of the story to the grave. Arthur asked how he ended up like this, gesturing to his father's deplorable state. Ezekiel said simply that he lost hope. After months of trying to survive on odd jobs, he started drinking. The drink helped him forget that he had lost everything: family, profession, dignity. Eventually, he lost even the temporary jobs. That was when he started living on the streets. 5 years in the sewers, Arthur murmured, horrified. Ezekiel explained that the tunnels were safer than the streets. Other homeless people were sometimes violent. Down there he was protected, and he could find food that people threw into the manholes. It wasn't a life, it was just existence. At that moment, Lily entered the room carrying a drawing she had made with colored pencils a nurse had given her. It was a drawing of 3 figures holding hands, a tall man, a small child, and another figure that clearly represented Arthur. She said cheerfully, "Look what I made, Grandpa Ezekiel," oblivious to the tension in the air. She had drawn their new family. The word family echoed in the room like a bell. Arthur looked at the girl's drawing and felt something break inside his chest. Lily had spent only 2 days with them and already considered them family. A family that included a man she had saved from the sewers and another who had decided to help her on impulse. Ezekiel said it was very beautiful, dear, his voice choked with emotion. Dr. Morris chose that moment to enter the room with new test results, stating that he needed to talk to Mr. Harrison about Lily's medical situation. They stepped into the hallway, leaving Ezekiel and Lily admiring the drawing. Arthur asked what they had found. Out. The doctor said gravely that the child had a congenital heart defect that required urgent surgery. It was a delicate and expensive procedure. Without the operation, she might not survive more than a few months. Arthur felt the world spin. As if discovering Ezekiel was his father wasn't enough, now Lily was facing a potentially fatal condition. He asked how much the surgery cost. Approximately $150,000, including all pre- and post-operative procedures, the doctor replied, and it would need to be done in Chicago at a specialized hospital. $150,000. For Arthur, it was a significant but not impossible sum. For Lily, it was the difference between life and death. He asked what would happen if they didn't do the operation. The doctor explained she would start showing more severe symptoms in the coming weeks. Shortness of breath, fainting spells, chest pain. The condition would deteriorate until Dr. Morris didn't finish the sentence. Arthur looked through the doorway of the room and saw Lily showing her drawing to a nurse, excitedly explaining who each person was. The girl radiated life and hope despite everything she had been through. The thought of losing her was unbearable. Arthur told the doctor, making the most important decision of his life, to arrange everything necessary. He would pay for her surgery. The doctor began to say that this was a very serious decision, but Arthur interrupted. He knew exactly what he was doing. Lily was going to have this surgery, and she would have the best possible care. He told the doctor to start the preparations immediately. As the doctor walked away to make the necessary arrangements, Arthur returned to the room where he found a scene that touched him deeply. Ezekiel was softly singing a lullaby that he remembered from his own childhood, and Lily was falling asleep in his skeletal arms. For a moment, Arthur saw not a beggar and an orphan, but a grandfather lovingly caring for his granddaughter. He saw the family he had lost 46 years ago, and the family he was gaining in a completely unexpected way. But he knew the battle was just beginning. Catherine would never accept the revelation about Ezekiel. Lily's surgery would be just the first of many challenges, and he still had to deal with decades of anger and resentment for a father who perhaps never deserved his hatred. When he arrived home that night, Catherine was waiting with divorce papers on the living room table. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to my channel. I promise to bring you videos every day that will make your life happier. Comment what you thought of my story, giving it a rating from 0 to 10, and thank you very much.